All right, good afternoon, seniors. I am off in Omaha right now, so Mrs. Simonson obviously is your sub today. We are going to be looking today at adolescence through adulthood. What we're going to be focusing on, we looked at early development earlier on this week, kind of focusing on how you develop from infancy into childhood, going through Piaget's stages. Now we're going to focus a little bit more on the transition to your more formative teenage years, to full adulthood, and also onto dying. And especially we're going to look at what happens in the mind in those particular years. So we'll be focusing on that today. Feel free to pause, rewind this as necessary. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I will remove myself from the screen here. All right, and here we go. So the first thing we got to talk about, of course, if we're talking about your teenage years, is we got to hit puberty. Until puberty, there's about an equal amount of androgens and estrogens for boys and girls. So the male sex hormones and the female hormones are about equal in boys and girls up until we hit puberty. When puberty arrives, of course, that's when you're going to have an imbalance where in males, androgens will be produced at a higher level, and for females, estrogen will be produced at a higher level. The exact timing of puberty, and I put these numbers up here, but let's remember that it is very different for everyone. Some people are early bloomers, some people are late bloomers, but if we were to take a general average, for girls, puberty starts about age 10 and lasts until about age 16. That is when, as your book says, girls are considered to be to have reached a state of maturity. For boys, it's a little bit later. Boys, it usually starts around 12 years old and lasts until they turn 18. During puberty, it's important to understand that this is when your brain is undergoing major development. Now, throughout your childhood, of course, your brain is developing, learning and growing. But in your teenage years, your brain is considered to be undergoing the same just greatness and change as it would be as when you were born. So obviously, puberty is not just a huge point in time for your physiological, for growing taller, for growing sex organs, but also for your brain. Your brain is also experiencing major changes during puberty. One of the key components in understanding, I guess, all transitions in life, Erik Erikson came up with what he called the stages of psychosocial development. And what he came up with, it was this linear idea where during each time of life, there was some sort of conflict that somebody had to resolve. So if you're an infant to 18 months, you have to find out if you can trust your caregivers or not trust your caregivers, all the way down to 65 and older and into death. Today we're not going to talk about from infancy till 13 years old, but I really want you to key in on the ones from age 13 basically till death. I do want you to write down these ages and what psychosocial conflict that Erik Erikson stated was going on in these time periods. We will go into a little bit more detail about these, but I really want you to know these. These will be good test questions, and these are also just good things to know and maybe things to assess for your own life and see if you see these things. So let's get down to adolescence first. So adolescence is considered to be the time period where you are transitioning from childhood to adulthood. You remember during sociology class, we talked about how adolescence is still a relatively new concept. Up until the 1900s, we really didn't consider adolescence to even be a time period. Nowadays, it's universally accepted in Western societies that adolescence is indeed a time period that exists in a person's development. It's still not necessarily accepted in Eastern cultures, and again, a lot of that has to do with factors of culture, how long you rely on your parents, are our focus on individuality, and so there are a lot of different things that go into that. Within your adolescent years, which for Erik Erikson was listed as between the years of 13 and 21, there is kind of a fundamental struggle. On the one hand, there's the need to stand out. In adolescence, you're trying to develop who you are, your identity. That's one thing Erik Erikson emphasizes, is finding your identity. And so there's a need to stand out and be independent. That's why there's a lot of tension in your adolescent years between parents and their kids. It's not necessarily that kids have suddenly started hating their parents. It's that kids have suddenly decided that they are trying to develop who they are and trying to develop their identity apart from their parents. And so there's this need to be independent and to stand out. But on the other hand, there's also a need to conform and to belong. And we've talked about this need before. We rely so much on friendships, on relationships to provide solid social structures. And so on the other hand, there's also this need to belong and to receive this acceptance. And these two things can be at odds with each other, because sometimes a group that you might consider yourself a part of, or some identity that you might think others have for you, may not necessarily be how you feel about yourself. And that's kind of like that identity crisis that I have this tomato facing over here. On the one hand, you might be classified as like, oh, let's just say like, oh, you're classified as an extremely nerdy person, and that's just who you are. You like to read, and you're really smart, and you're all about computers and stuff. But in reality, maybe you also have a deep love of sports, and maybe you're actually very athletic. This doesn't neatly fall into our mental categories, and maybe doesn't necessarily neatly fall into the things that you and your group of people that you hang out with, what they do. But it's also who you are. So it's this struggle between independence and acceptance. During your teenage years, there's a focus on creating a personally acceptable identity, and a sense of self that is what is consistent with how you want to be. And this is a long struggle. And I mean, you see it throughout those awkward middle school years. You can probably all think about when you were 7th or 8th graders. I know I never want to be a 7th or 8th grader again. You can probably think about your own experiences being junior high kids and just the awkwardness involved as you're just trying to discover who you are, who you want to be, and who you don't want to be. That's all part of this kind of finding yourself and developing this sense of self that you are comfortable with. Where it gets really interesting is when you have other, as white people, we don't necessarily experience a conflict over ethnic identity, but for people who immigrate to the United States, or who maybe have diverse ethnic backgrounds, maybe there are many people who are biracial, whose maybe one parent was white and one parent was black, or one parent was white and the other was Latino. In those situations, when you have people with diverse backgrounds, ethnic identity is a lot of times another conflict that is experienced during this time. And your book talks about 4 different ways in which ethnic identity can be developed during this period of adolescence. If you feel a strong tie to your ethnic identity, and at the same time, that acculturation word on the left-hand side, I should say, that acculturation word means how much do you integrate into the larger culture? How much if you immigrate to a new country, how much do you accept the culture of the country you immigrated to? So if you have a strong ethnic identity, you hold on to your family's ethnic identity, but you also are very much accepting of the culture that you have become a part of, then you are considered bicultural, because you have these 2 sides to you. And it is possible to maintain both of them, although it is an interesting balance. If you have a weak ethnic identity, if yes, you come from a culture, but if you don't affiliate strongly with that, and instead you tend to affiliate with the larger culture around you, then you are considered to be assimilated. You have assimilated into the society, basically become a member of the larger society. This is what happens a lot of times with children of immigrants. We see there's this balance between whether they will hold on to their ethnic identity or whether they will assimilate. And we see that in our society there's a big pressure to assimilate, and many children of immigrants do assimilate because they feel like that will, help them advance within society. If you do not feel strong ties to the culture at large, and you feel strong ties to your own ethnic identity, then you are kind of separatist. You are kind of in a resistance against the larger society around you, and you're holding on to the identity that your ethnicity, your ethnic identity. If both of these are weak, we call this marginal. It means there's a big sense of a lack of belonging to anything. You don't feel like you belong to the larger culture. You don't feel like your belonging is found in your ethnicity, and so there's just a lack of belonging, and there could be some sense of a loss of identity there. Okay, let's transition now into the time period that you guys will be entering in not too long from now, and this is your young adulthood years. According to Erik Erikson, your young adulthood years was a time for exploration of intimate friendships. This was where his conflicting ideas were relationships versus loneliness. That was his thing. I believe intimacy is the word I believe he uses. Intimacy versus isolation, I believe, were his words. And this includes a time period that psychologists have recently begun to use more and more often. That's called emerging adulthood. And that's the time when you're past puberty, you have basically become sexually mature, but you're still reliant on your parents. And this is really common in Western society, maybe not so much in other countries around the world. But I mean, this is basically your college years, when, yes, you've become mature, but still, you're heavily reliant on your parents. You maybe spend summers at home. You're still very much interacting with your parents, involved with your parents, and so you're not completely independent, as we would think for adulthood. You're still kind of in an in-between state. And it's interesting because this is a psychological development, but again, this is where we cross the line into sociology, because this is influenced by economic factors. Having to find a job, the fact that the cost of college has risen over the past 20 years. These have pushed this stage of emerging adulthood onto many people in Western society today. All right, as you transition into your 40s, there's a new focus. According to Erikson, there's a different focus. And your focus in your 40s is on productivity. You're about halfway through your life. You've found a job, you've been working for years, and you kind of take a moment to assess, and you wonder, has my life been useful and worthwhile? Am I going where I want to be? Is this track that I'm on, is it good? Or do I want to do something else with the rest of my life? And if you feel like your life has not been worthwhile and productive, this can lead to a midlife crisis. That's why for Erik Erikson, his conflict is about productivity. That's one half of it, and the other half is fear over that. And midlife crisis, we joke about it. I mean, I even have a picture here of a guy experiencing a midlife crisis by buying a new Mazda. But we joke about it, but a midlife crisis is a very serious occurrence, and not everyone experiences it, but many people do. In fact, I would argue most do. And it's a very serious time to assess and consider, what am I wanting to do with my life, and is it going to be, am I going towards a goal that I like? This is also when the onset of menopause occurs, and menopause is the cessation of menstruation. And you can get me for my spelling because I just now realized that I did not even put the word menstruation down there. You can knock me over that when I get back, but this is also going to be something we see in middle adulthood. The last stage that Erik Erikson had was late adulthood. His was about 65 to death. And this focuses on looking back and asking whether life was well lived. And basically the conflict here is integrity versus despair. If somebody looks back on their life and can tell happy stories about the things that they did, then in Erikson's mind this was a life lived with integrity, a life where it was worthwhile, You feel accomplished and happy about what you have done, and so overall you are feeling very well. If you have a lot of regrets or you feel like you missed something, then Erikson believed that the other side was despair. An important thing to talk about as we get into the whole late adulthood thing is, does your intelligence change throughout life? And the answer is yes and no. Unfortunately, your fluid intelligence, that's your problem-solving abilities, your ability to reason deductively, this does decline with age, unfortunately. When you reach about, I believe the age is 30, your fluid intelligence just slowly starts declining. Unfortunately, that's just what happens with age. But on a positive note, your crystallized intelligence, your cognitive skills, or your specific knowledge of events, your memories, your ability to remember does not really change, and this remains strong throughout age, so that is encouraging. You're not just going to forget something because you become older, meaning forgetting past events. Another interesting myth about late adulthood that maybe we as younger people sometimes have is that you cannot have strong, good relationships into older adulthood. And I hope these pictures on the right show you that, yes, indeed, you can have good, very strong, loving relationships in older adulthood. One thing we definitely have to talk about, though, because I was talking about that crystallized intelligence and how your memory stays strong throughout the years. There are exceptions, of course, and this is where we dip a little bit out of mental disorders and psychological disorders, and this is dementia and Alzheimer's disease that we have to talk about. Dementia is a set of symptoms related to thinking, memory loss, changes in personality, and confusion that interfere with regular functioning. And so these are things where you're gonna start basically forgetting. You're gonna start losing some aspects of your memory. And it's to the point where it interferes with everyday life. That's the thing. The occasional forgetting is not dementia, but to the point where it interferes with everyday life, that's when we have crossed the line. And the extreme form of that is Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a progressive, irreversible form of dementia. It's a very sad ordeal, and as you can see on the map on the bottom right, there are many people who live with dementia, and it's expected to continue to grow. We have lots of money poured into research. We still are just not completely sure about what causes dementia or how we reverse the effects. We do know that some things like, for example, getting a good amount of sleep has been proven to correlate with, so getting 8 hours of sleep, getting your regular amount of sleep, correlates with not getting dementia. So that is a positive sign there, and an encouragement for you guys to get sleep. Another important thing to say is, although dementia and Alzheimer's disease are common, they are not normal disorders for all humans. Take a look at those numbers there. There are 7 billion people in the world. Of those 7 billion, 131.5 million, that's the projection for 2050. Let's scale it back down to the one in 2015. 46.8 million. Out of 7 billion people in the world, a little less than 50 million of us have dementia. Percentage-wise, that's a small number. It is still a great number, and it's still a large amount of people, and we can't ignore it. But I just don't want you to be like living in fear that when you get old, you're going to get dementia. It's just not, it's not something you should necessarily be in fear about. All right, quick recap. Go over which of Erikson's stages deals with identity, and what is fluid intelligence, and also, do we hold on to it with age? The funnies for today. Admit it. This is how you eat popcorn at movies. I saw this at the local t-shirt shop. Someone's feeling a little salty. And finally, when you ask your mom if you can stop by McDonald's and she says yes. All right, that is all I have for notes today, guys. I hope you all have a good day, and I will see you come Monday.